What defines a sense of community? How are we able to measure something that can't be seen, yet is so intertwined through the very fabric of our social beings? Even turning to the exact definition of community, we have nothing tangible to show how well a community is functioning or being managed. There is no known method to monitor how much internal energy is needed to maintain this sense of community, or how much time and effort is required to sustain this feeling of belonging. Upon beginning my research and scripting for this community analysis, I pondered on what I felt the meaning of community was and how this sense of belonging could be internalized, and the word that kept coming to mind was pulse. Steady and unwavering, the pulse is the rhythmic driving force of our bodies. It is the conduit for moving energy through the being and can be a strong indicator for how our body is feeling. Never flashy, but always present, the pulse is the supporting act for the rest of the cast in this great sense of community. For the video game genre, the feeling of that true, positive pulse has lost much of its relevance, often being overshadowed by multi-million-dollar marketing campaigns featuring sports stars and Hollywood celebrities pushing the latest incarnation of a reskinned title on the gaming community with the relentless force of a Class 5 hurricane. What these games lack in true content or sense of community, they attempt to overshadow in sheer hype and marketing promotions, and ultimately, it is these types of games and marketing strategies that have produced some of the most toxic gaming communities on record. According to a top 5 worst game communities list published by GameSkinny.com in 2016, Minecraft, World of Tanks, Call of Duty, CSGO, and League of Legends were identified as having the worst online gaming communities and were afflicted by the same toxic and demoralizing behavior across all of these titles. Toxic players and communities are the reason many new players stop playing the game before they've actually gotten into it and improved, and it is this toxicity that ultimately stalls the growth of a game or gaming community. In terms of concurrent player counts, the toxic title will be able to maintain the core rusted on diehards, but in the areas of player growth, involvement, enrichment, and overall attachment to the game, it can never fully mature or evolve. Warframe, the free-to-play RPG shooter from Digital Extremes, serves as a shining example of the exact opposite to this toxic trend in online communities. Much of what the development team at DE decides upon is in fact the exact opposite of what the rest of the gaming industry says should be done. When the rest of the game studios zig, Digital Extremes zags. When the rest of the industry said, "Don't make a game about sci-fi because it will fail," Digital Extremes surged forward with their singular vision of producing a genre-defining game that could evolve and mature with its player base. The result of that desire to excel has propelled Warframe, which launched in 2013, into the top 5 most played games on the Steam charts, and all of this from a game that has, up until this year, never advertised and is built on a free-to-play model. I found Warframe in the PlayStation Store back in early 2014 and immediately fell in love with this sci-fi shooter and played it non-stop for nearly a year. I recently downloaded Warframe again, this time for my PC, and was quickly re-enraptured by the player power fantasy that only this game can deliver. Being a little older and wiser than the last time I played, I began to ask myself how this game and community had sustained itself so admirably over the 4 years since launch versus other gaming titles. You see, I've always been a person and gamer that asks why, and I've never been afraid to ask that question to anyone at any time. It is my insatiable curiosity that drives my quest for more understanding, more knowledge, more know-how that keeps me coming back to this one game and asking that singular question, why? Why has this game succeeded when other games have not? Why has this online community not only maintained a positive direction and pulse, but grown stronger each and every year when other games have faltered and been forgotten? And why, even to this day, when I search for it on YouTube, have I never seen a meaningful review of Warframe's community model? So I began reaching out to the team at Digital Extremes, who were at this point hurriedly getting prepared for PAX West and spending insane amounts of time getting the Plains of Eidolon, Warframe's much anticipated open world environment, ready for launch. At first, I was met with the sound of silence and no responses, but in their defense, they were working around the clock and had other projects that were requiring their full attention. And then, in mid-August, Rebecca Ford, community developer for Warframe, responded to my requests, and we coordinated a date and time to sit down and discuss all things Warframe Community. The video I now present to you is a result of my curiosities and the community knowledge provided by Rebecca. This is Lieutenant BuzzLitebeer, and I would like to present to you my community review for Warframe. Many anecdotes came to mind as I began to work on this review, but none felt better to start this look into Warframe's past than this quote from Oscar Wilde, the famous Irish playwright, poet, and author. And I feel it absolutely essential to paint a picture of the past so that we can better appreciate the present. For Warframe and Digital Extremes, that past is one of hardship and near financial ruin, but it is within these trials by fire that the staff at DE was hardened and became battle-tested, and this is where the story of Rebecca Ford begins. She began work with Digital Extremes in 2011 as an intern from Western University and assisted with media and technical components for one of the studio's previous titles, Darkness 2, but immediately transitioned over the moment the Warframe concept became a reality. Every piece of social infrastructure for Warframe would need to be built from the ground up, including support and forums, in the hopes that this venture was successful, and all of it would need to be done quickly and with no help from the rest of the studio. You see, there was no staff or manpower available to help with the community support preparations, and Rebecca was tasked with sourcing the software tools necessary to maintain a solid community infrastructure in the event they did hire the necessary manpower. Based on her research, Zendesk was incorporated into the account flow, a forum platform was created, and with the help of an external web designer, they didn't have an internal web designer on staff, everything was made ready for the upcoming launch. It was during this formative period that it became painfully clear that nobody was going to pay Digital Extremes to make the game, and in the studio's opinion, it wasn't a polished enough product to sell either. The only way Warframe could be brought to market was using the free-to-play model, and the staff at Digital Extremes was very scared of the stigma tied to this association and did their best not to contribute to it, all while being acutely aware that this was the only way Warframe was going to succeed. These were truly dark days for Digital Extremes, as without any outside funding, they had to lay off staff to make the game. One point that really stuck with me from the initial moments of our discussion is how badly Digital Extremes needed Warframe to succeed, and how all in on Warframe the company had truly gone. It's one thing to read about that section of Digital Extremes' past in condensed text form, but to see and hear it expressed in real time by somebody that lived in that very moment transcends anything you could have read about their position. There was no guarantee that this genre of game would succeed. There was no financial bailout or backing awaiting them if Warframe flopped. There was no safety net to catch them if they fell. They were completely on their own, and make no mistake about it, Warframe was Digital Extremes' last creative attempt to save their company. But launch it did, and those early months of Warframe's PC launch were touch and go. For the first 5 months of its existence, Rebecca remembers writing support tickets, along with Steve Sinclair and several other members of the team. In addition, she was still handling her normal position of community manager, and the workload had finally reached a critical level. Megan was hired in August 2013 to help alleviate some of that crushing workload as the studio was fresh off their successful attendance of Gamescom 2013. The game was received with praise, and from that point forward, the meteoric rise from obscurity to fame began for Digital Extremes, and has arrived 4 years later at the point we now see it. So now that we've covered the humble origins from whence Warframe was born and arrived at present day, let's take a look at how the community development team has grown with it, and their core principles and philosophies to maintaining a positive pulse for this ever-evolving online family. The key to any online gaming community's success is communication. And as I conducted my interview of Rebecca, she kept stressing the importance of open lines of communication and transparency. At its core, the community team understands that Warframe has been and will continue to be a community-focused game. And with that, they must also express to the player base that while the game is insanely fun and has a good grind, it will never be perfect, and it will take the combined efforts of the team along with the community in order to try and make it as perfect as possible. Digital Extreme's development cycle for new content is too rapid, and while the dev team iterates on a truly ambitious scale and strives to create new content that is fun to play, and in the studio's eyes that is the most important factor, it will inherently always have flaws and oversight. If the community team were to act as if those imperfections did not exist, the player base would resent it. Instead, they choose to acknowledge the flaws and imperfections with honesty instead of focusing their energies in an effort to paint them over. Now, since the flaws are confirmed, it becomes more of a constructive partnership between the team and the player base versus what other game studios choose to do, and that they sweep the flaws aside or deny them entirely. One of the true measures of success for the community team is that players keep coming back to contribute, and that can be interpreted in many facets of the community. A person returning to the game and opening a line of communication is a sign that they are interested enough in what Warframe and the community offers that they want to participate. Whether it be the forums, Reddit, Twitter, Twitch chat, or a partner's YouTube comment section, those types of efforts are considered healthy. The community team has been built up in order to have a general presence in all of those forums, as it is important that the players know and feel that somebody is there and listening. Speaking of those aforementioned social forums, back in 2012, when Warframe went into alpha testing and the studio saw that players were actually playing the game, it really reinforced the tools of the time and the need to use them. Twitch was becoming popular in 2012, and the Warframe team knew they wanted a strong presence both there and in the YouTube community. In addition, they evaluated the free-to-play portion of the industry and internalized that fun factor of online events that mixed the team with the player base. At the time, Firefall was conducting events with their bus, and the Warframe team used that as a basis for their virtual events. It became obvious that since events can't always be running around the clock, they needed to look for a virtual substitute for what they wanted it to feel like in real-life situations. True to their maverick nature, the Warframe team implemented what felt right to them and followed their own interests, steering clear of the AAA studio's map to success. You see, Warframe didn't have an advertising or marketing budget, so for them, conducting their events virtually meant they were making intelligent decisions with their means, as all they needed was a camera and bandwidth. Over the 5-year period since Warframe launched, the community facet of online gaming has become more and more difficult, and we've all seen what happens when a game does something that is perceived as anti-gamer. And no online community is more prepared to bring that injustice to the forefront than the gaming community. The community team has to be prepared to do what is right for the greater gaming community because they never want to put themselves in the spotlight of such a situation. Ultimately, there are always people behind the scenes that are making the games, and it is important to take a step back and remember that. For the Warframe community, they have a textbook case of regs to success, because they really were on the out, and if another game doesn't have that, then they interpret it differently. For Rebecca, getting involved into the production of the game as the Lotus is not a new concept that Warframe introduced, but it is a practice that more games have started to implement, and for the community team, it serves as a model that has a tremendously positive effect on the relationships with the player base. If the team is involved in the game's development, it gives them ownership. For example, Rebecca, she has a presence in the game as the Lotus. That means she has a stake in the game and isn't just a community mouthpiece because she's involved in every aspect of its development. This emotionally attached partnership style of community management is much more time consuming than if they were to just publish the game and then limit the communication between the team and the player base. You see, as this collaborative effort between the team and the community strengthens, the player base becomes more emotionally attached to their work versus if they were to just purchase and play the game. And it is this heightened emotional attachment that leads to more and more discourse. Now, in reality, this method of discussion is not scalable to today's player base counts, as the more comments the team receives, the less time they have to devote to each request. Back when Warframe first launched, the player base was much smaller than present day, so the criticisms could be discussed in much more detail, as opposed to now where the product is so large and each player wants to discuss every aspect of the game in depth. In addition, this deep connection to the game itself requires a community team member to have a patient, calm demeanor, especially when a member of the player base is really blasting the product. When the team sees a comment saying something mean-spirited, they attempt to look more deeply into the content of the comment to see what it is the player is truly trying to say. Now, this is an extremely important skill for a member of the team to have because most of what they see is going to be slanted towards a particular style that appeals to frustration. For Rebecca, the failures really come down to how authentic the players feel you are, and the more authentic you want to be with that community developer connection, the more time it takes, which means the less you can do it, and writing something that really speaks to player concerns takes time. If it's a real controversy or hot topic, the team really needs to take the time to understand and research the issue at hand, and by then, sometimes it's too late. Still, it is something that the team needs to be extremely careful with, as they can kill things very quickly if they make bad pattern choices, especially within a game as a service. Within that relationship, the team understands that they would not exist if it were not for the community, which has seen the very best and worst of what Warframe has to offer. So when they are making colossal mistakes in the community's mind, the team still wants to receive the feedback. They want to know if that was the straw that broke the camel's back, or was it a singular action that led to the player's frustrations. If a player leaves the community in silence, that is considered the worst possible outcome. If that player stays, even in anger, that is considered a positive outcome, because at least the team gets a chance to make it right. As a point of interest, the Warframe team doesn't view the player base as consumers, but rather as investors, and that relationship between studio and player base is what the community team attempts to keep in constant harmony. Rebecca stressed to me that the team doesn't go anywhere, they don't disappear, and they're always present, and that consistent presence adds to the feeling of harmony and just how accessible the team really is. Furthermore, that relationship grows stronger when the player sees results for changes or content that they wanted, and more emotional when they feel their needs are not being met. This is why Rebecca likes the immediacy of the dev stream format so much, as it allows the most time to acknowledge the player issues on the team's biggest platform, and in terms of feedback loop, it is always the strongest in the player's eyes on the dev stream. It's face-to-face with the developer, where she can look the developer in the eye, raise the player's issues, and then from there, it's what can be done in the moment. And speaking of in the moment, it is important to understand how the community team handles issues and controversy, even when the root cause is their own unbridled ambitions. So let's now take a look at that facet of the online team, and some of their practices may surprise you. As this review has gone through many different variations and edits, I considered moving this portion of my community review to the beginning of the script, as in many regards, this is how the player base sees the community team and measures how well they are functioning. However, I felt that the most important content I was trying to convey was not what they do when all hell breaks loose, but more what they do to keep those types of situations from ever arising. In terms of communication between studio and community, there are 3 schools of feedback that most aspects of the game can be broken into. Rebecca says that most of what the community team sees on a daily basis can be broken into feedback clusters or categories, which are monetization, balance, and fun and/or game breaking. And to be clear, each of these feedback clusters needs to be handled in a different manner, as a one solution for all issues model simply doesn't work, and Warframe doesn't subscribe to that method. For the purpose of our discussion, I will cover the first 2 clusters of monetization and balance, as those are the 2 most common categories of feedback that the team receives. First up is how the team handles monetization issues, and to be clear, when I speak of monetization, I am referring to resource costs to craft new gear and not to spending real money in-game. An example of this scenario is when the studio releases a new prime frame, and if the team sees a crafting cost come to the table that they think will trigger a negative response from the community, they change it. In Rebecca's eyes, the team is getting into a pattern of catching those crafting imbalances before they are released, although they do still occasionally slip by. And when those issues do arise, the team always looks at the bigger picture. At this point, the game has nearly 400 weapons, and they have to critically analyze how a single weapon compares to the other 400, and for this, the team relies on statistics to justify why it is this weapon is where it is in comparison to the others. The team has gotten to a point of reaching consistency for crafting cost when releasing new items into the game, and they rarely see those sticker shock moments anymore. The second and more emotionally charged strain of feedback has to do with balance, as this is a PvE-focused game, and players like to feel powerful. And when the studio releases a new weapon, it is generally received with positivity by the community until they see how it compares to the other weapons that they have collected over the years and are now rendered inferior. For the team, those imbalances are tricky to adjust, and while they do buff in batches, the player base still wants to know what the studio has planned for their entire back catalog of now superfluous weaponry. Right now, and self-admittedly, the team doesn't have a great plan of attack to address those legacy items, but as the poor outliers of performance do appear, they address them. In rare cases, the team does nerf items, but it is a thin line they need to navigate between the 2 schools of thought. On one side are the players that feel the studio needs to nerf more, and that the game has become mindless clicking with no real challenge. On the other side is the school of thought that wants the studio to buff everything else because they love the feeling of being all-powerful. For the community team, this is the most difficult feedback point to address, as the community is rarely unanimous in their thoughts on this subject. When the team makes tweaks to Warframes, that is when it gets the most personal for players, so they do their reworks more frequently, and admittedly, they never seem to go over perfectly. Remember when I mentioned that sometimes the root cause of the studio's issues is their own unbridled ambitions? Well, here it is. In terms of iteration cycles, it is very difficult for the team because they are constantly searching for ways to make sure the changes they make to the Warframes are good, and that the players understand why the studio made the changes they did. For the team, the latter part of that struggle is difficult to do well, because despite their best intentions, they miss something that allows the player to see the changes from the studio's point of view, when really all the player cares about is their own point of view, which is the player's right. The players are absolutely right in that they play the way they play with what the studio gives them, and that determines, in Rebecca's opinion, how it should be skewed. On one side, you have the dev team that is technically proficient at their jobs, and at this point has brought 30+ unique Warframes to the game. On the other side, you have the players, who after getting their hands on a certain Warframe may have a different point of view as to the capabilities of that particular frame, and the studio respects that. For the community team, it comes down to respecting the players' feedback as well as the dev team's vision, and balancing those 2 differing voices can be an extremely difficult proposition. The team has to be on a state of constant vigilance to not let grudges be formed, and if they are formed and the team sees it, they speak to them. It is completely acceptable for the team to bring up the past, including poor choices the studio has made, so that they don't become a point of resentment. And the more the team can open up a dialogue about those darker moments in their past, the more people realize that it wasn't that they caught the team in the act of malice. It has always been a case of the studio did what they could in the limited time they had, and if it didn't quite work out as intended, they've made changes. And speaking to that list of requested changes, Rebecca expressed to me that it is so long that they aren't able to get to all the little things that the player base has requested over the years. One of her goals for the team is to develop a better way to show the studio's current roadmap to those requested changes in the hopes that it helps explain to the community why it takes so long to make those changes happen. On one hand, you have the players that are excited by the rapid iteration, and on the other hand, you have members of the community that feel that rapid iteration comes at the cost of long-term polish. The team relies on the community and their ability to provide instant feedback, but both the studio and players struggle with how committed they are to that catalog of polish. Digital Extremes is finding that the longer their game is live, the more difficult it is to balance and address those items, and for the community team, serving as advocates on both ends of that transparency is paramount. Trying to keep the players happy is a noble cause, but to show them that they are respected is their true goal. For the team, they can start to see the beginnings of issues forming when the player base feels that they are not being heard, and it is important to remember there is only so much a handful of community team members can do to accommodate nearly 30 million players' every want and need. Even facing the fact that they are hopelessly outnumbered, the community team keeps going and never lets the oversight slow them or the game down, and ultimately, they know they will need to constantly keep working on their ability to respond to the community's needs. And speaking of constantly working and improving the player experience, I do have some thoughts to share with you about how the team strives to improve the player-studio relationships and future plans for the community team. Before addressing what the team has planned for the bulk of their time in the near future, I would like to touch on a few of the methods that they have implemented to help build the studio-player bond and will continue to use and improve on for the future. The first of these elements is the fan art section of every primetime Twitch broadcast, and it is used as a platform to recognize just how strong the bond between the player base and Warframe truly is. Players are encouraged to submit anything from sketches, paintings, pixel art, really the sky's the limit, and the team showcases a few selections each week along with any backstory that has been provided as part of the submission. This simple act of showing the featured visuals serves as a tremendously strong showcase for the creative side of the community, and according to Rebecca, the studio saw the powerful potential of this media, and it has been a part of the broadcast from their inception. Building on that simple idea and running wild with the concept, Tenogen was introduced and allowed players to showcase their 3D art skills with the possibilities of the studio purchasing their designs, with the idea that they would then be sold to the player base. The basis for Tenogen started as a polycount contest and player skins, and has now grown into a platform that not only serves to showcase but educate new students to the 3D art system. Until somewhat recently, Tenogen was exclusive to PC, as the restrictions of the console networks for selling vanity items did not allow for Warframe fans on PlayStation or Xbox to purchase these brilliant offerings. Seeing that injustice against a huge portion of the player base, Rebecca worked with an attorney to construct a contract for buyout rights and therefore made it possible for console players to view and purchase Tenogen offerings. All the while, reinforcing that social presence has been the studio's unwavering support of their commitment to Twitch and their Twitch partners. As of the time I completed and posted this review, Digital Extremes has just reached the milestone of their 100th dev stream and is soon approaching their 200th primetime play stream. It is also important to note the awesome community building power that has been seen at TennoCon. This year, nearly 2,000 faithful Tenno descended on London, Ontario to mingle, learn, and discuss all things Warframe related, with all proceeds going to charity. In addition, Digital Extremes has 166 official Twitch and YouTube channel partners that serve as ambassadors for the community team and all things Warframe, and many of these creators were used as educators at this year's convention. Looking towards the future, the entire community team will be spending extra hours helping out the player base as the Plains of Eidolon launched last month for PC and will be introduced to the console community in mid-November. For hardcore players like Rebecca that have played the game for the last 5 years, it is truly refreshing to see something like the Plains of Eidolon be released, as it is such a unique take on Warframe, and the fact that it's not perfect doesn't matter to them, just that it's different and creative. And speaking to that different take on Warframe that the Plains of Eidolon will present to the player base, at the heart of the transition into this new experience will be the community team, learning all about the changes and features that the Plains will unveil, setting expectations, and communicating them as impeccably as possible is the community team's primary focus for the foreseeable future. As I end this review, I truly feel that the future of Warframe's community is in the same capable hands that it has always been, and is more than prepared for whatever challenges it is met with in the future. Now, even though we may never be able to truly quantify how well or poorly an online community is functioning, it is safe to say that we can feel when it is so. In Warframe's case, their pulse is strong and their message positive and unwavering, and I applaud the studio's ambitious iteration cycles and unbridled passion to try and bring something to market that is truly unique and their very own. There is nothing truer than familiarity breeds contempt, and the fact that Digital Extremes never settles for the safe choice is inspiring to anybody that has taken the time to get to know this game. Now, as the studio continues to shoot for the stars, there will undoubtedly be misses, and that is where the entire community team can be found. Never flashy, but always present, masterfully completing their supporting act in this great sense of belonging.